Hello. Today I'll be responding to an article from America, the Jesuit Review. The article is called Who's Afraid of Transhumanism? Parentheses, We All Should Be, and it was written by John J. Conley on September 5th, 2017. I'll just state when the paragraph starts and ends and then go over what I think of the individual paragraph. It is difficult to define, but it's a growing movement. Transhumanism has its own central organization, Humanity Plus, its own demographic base, Silicon Valley, even its own political formation, the Longevity Party, and paragraph. Well, right off the bat, I have a few issues. First of all, maybe Humanity Plus is largest. I think it's like some online group you can be a part of. But I hardly think that every single transhumanism belongs to Humanity Plus. It's not like how every single Catholic belongs to the Catholic Church. And with that in mind, Silicon Valley is hardly the demographic base of transhumanism. Like, with a lot of religions, there's sites like Mecca, or the Western Wall, or the Vatican, that are sites with major historical or theological significance. It's where the politics was formed. It's where the politics is currently being formed. It's where a major event has happened in the history of that religion. Silicon Valley isn't that. It's just the technological hub for the United States. It's just where all these different technological products are developed, but those technological products aren't necessarily transhumanist. Laptops are great, but they aren't exactly merging themselves with humanity and augmenting our species. Most transhumanists, I would be willing to guess, don't live in the Silicon Valley area. A few might, a sizable portion even, but it's hardly a demographic base. And the same applies to the political formation, the Longevity Party. Transhumanists have varying different politics. There's libertarian transhumanists and anarchist transhumanists, and there's more liberal progressive transhumanists, and then there's also Mormon transhumanists who are more likely to have more conservative politics. No single party is going to be able to account for all of them, and I think it is a very bad idea to try to unite everyone of this specific philosophy under a specific political party, since that sort of just ensures that if the political party becomes shit, so too does the whole, aspiration for augmenting humanity and, moving beyond its limitations. And while one can still accept the premise of augmenting humanity and moving beyond the limitations without being a part of the political party, or calling yourself a transhumanist even, it is a very difficult thing to do, especially when those ideas become inherently tied in people's minds to that party or that term for the overall philosophy. Next paragraph. On one level, the movement's goals appear benign. One of its key documents, quote, Principle of Extrophy, end quote, sums up the basic values of transhumanism, and this is a quote, perpetual progress, self-transformation, practical optimism, intelligent technology, open society, self-direction, and rational thinking, end quote. the local Rotary Club would not object. I don't really have anything to say to this. Those are indeed things listed in the document. And I don't even think they are necessarily bad things, and honestly, the person who wrote this article doesn't seem to think they are either. So next paragraph. But the fundamental ambition of transhumanism is more problematic. Its architects champion a use of technology to accelerate the evolution of humanity so radically that it ends a process of humanity as such would disappear. A superior post-human being would emerge. According to Wikipedia, quote, transhumanism is the intellectual and cultural movement that affirms the possibility and desirability of fundamentally improving the human condition through applied reason, especially by developing and making widely available knowledge to eliminate aging and to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. End quote. From its inception, the abolition of human death and aging has been one of the goals of transhumanism as it engineers a new being freed from the biological constraints of the current human condition. Again, I think this is a fair assessment. One quibble might be that it's more accurate to say that a goal is to have an indefinite lifespan rather than say end death, since I know a lot of transhumanists would argue that people should have the right to sort of tap out of living when they feel like it, and understand that even if they have biological immortality, that doesn't mean an asteroid can't slam into the planet and kill them, let's say. Like, there will still be things that are able to kill them, it's just not due to biology itself. But I have no problem with any of these prospects of curing death, indefinite lifespans, or, fixing death. I think it's a good thing. Evolution is an unthinking process. Sure, it resulted in humanity, but now that we're able to think for ourselves and plan ahead, and actually critically examine ourselves, we can find a lot of problems that are ultimately just holding us back. I see no reason why we should move past those, even if it means the end result wouldn't be recognizably human. I'm going to read the next two paragraphs together. Two of the movement's philosophers, Max More and David Pearce, have developed eloquent apologies for the transhumanist creed, but they also indicate the movement's more ominous philosophical themes. The very concept of human nature disappears in much of transhumanist literature. The human body is dismissed as something of secondary, accidental importance. Mr. Moore argues that, quote, the self has to be instantiated in some physical medium, but not necessarily one that is biologically human or biological at all. End quote. Once again, in the history of philosophy, the body has become a mere container for the human mind. The body is perceived as an impediment to the mind's development rather than humanity's natural site for thought. Tellingly, in this new version of anthropological dualism, the soul has disappeared. It is the sovereign self, a liberated will yearning for omniscience and omnipotence, that remains. Unsurprisingly, Ayn Rand is one of the movement's favorite novelists. End paragraph. Well, I haven't read anything by Max More and David Pearce, So I'm not sure if your quote or assessment on their role in transhumanism is accurate, but I don't necessarily disagree with the quote you attribute to Mr. Moore that the self has to be instantiated in some physical medium. Every Everything we understand about the brain and how it works indicates that that is where the self is. That consciousness and thoughts are just an emergent property of the brain. And we know this because we've seen several instances of brain damage where it changed who a person fundamentally is. There's cases where people have short-term memory loss and aren't able to generate new memories due to brain damage. If you believe that the self is due to one's memories, that's what distinguishes person A from person B, then such damage would in fact change the self in a significant way. From brain damage, people change their personalities. People have perceptions of the universe that other people don't. And it can even damage people's perception of the universe, such as causing blindness. Not because the eyes don't work, but because... I apologize for clearing my throat there. But because the brain isn't able to register what the eyes see. So, if removing the soul from the equation is supposed to be the issue, then I'd say there's not really much of an issue. Neuroscience, not transhumanism, has done away with the soul. It'll take some very substantial evidence to show that there's some supernatural additional aspect of the self that relegates or has all these qualities that theists like to attribute to the soul that is somehow separate from the brain. Another thing is that while Mr. Moore understands that the self is initiated in some physical medium and just happens to be the human body, though it doesn't have to be, that doesn't mean that he or even any other transhumanist disagree that the body is the natural site for thought. They understand that, they just think that there could be a much better site for thought. And it's also worth pointing out that you sort of believe this too in some ways. You, a theist, believe that human beings have souls and that our bodies are just vessels that contain these souls until we die and our souls move on to the afterlife. So why exactly is it such a problem that these people think that the human body is just the vessel for human thought but doesn't have to be, but you believe that the body is just a vessel for the human soul, but as evident by the belief in the afterlife and going to heaven or hell, doesn't have to be. And like what I said about the politics earlier, some transhumanists might really like Ayn Rand. I'm not one of them. I think her philosophies are abhorrent and detrimental to the overall benefit of humanity. Laissez-faire capitalism, if ever enacted, would be horrible. Like, let me put it this way. People like to say, well, communism sounds good on paper, but it doesn't really work. And Rand's beliefs don't even sound good on paper. They're worse than communism. Let's begin the next paragraph. Not only is humanity freed from its biological finitude in the transhumanist dream, it no longer enjoys any unique status as a subject of rights. Max Moore claims that creatures with similar levels of sapience, sentience, and personhood are accorded similar status no matter whether they are human, animals, cyborgs, machine intelligences, or aliens. The religious claim that human beings are made in God's image, and the political claim that humans deserve respect because of their transcendental status, crumbles. Little of Renaissance humanism remains in a movement that glorifies the post-human being to come and consider humanity's fleeting phenomenon with no particular intrinsic dignity. I'd like to point out that quite a lot of religion and politics don't afford humanity to even humanity. For example, in extremely Islamic countries, unbelievers, homosexuals, women, and so many other groups of people are seen as inherently lesser and less deserving of certain rights than of groups that the religion deems to be like great and deserving of these more rights. And the same for politics. The idea of like we're all human beings and we by virtue we should be endowed with specific inalienable rights is a very recent one, and even when that concept was invented it wasn't exactly applied. There were still groups of people who didn't have the same rights as other groups of people. But I don't necessarily see what's wrong with the idea that if we manage to elevate an animal to the level of intelligence and consciousness and critical thinking capabilities and sentience and all of that as the average person, that animal shouldn't be afforded some more rights than, say, the animal before it was elevated. Or if we make a cyborg with that sort of mindset, assuming we make or machine intelligence is assuming we make them with a desire to have these rights and not do the smart thing and try to make them with no such desire and perhaps even a very strong desire for the opposite. Or aliens. Like, are you seriously telling me that if some aliens came down from the sky and initiated first contact with us, that we should deny them rights even though they would be even more special and incredible than humanity by virtue of being able to travel from world to world with seemingly relative ease? It just seems a bit odd. Well, sure, transhumanism is no longer like the Renaissance-esque glorification of the human body, but at this point, like, you have to understand that you can't always just glorify something and ignore its flaws. The human body has a lot of flaws, and that's what transhumanists point to as sources of extreme suffering in the world. Transhumanists can still like the human body and appreciate it. In fact, they sort of do a lot, because in a lot of depictions of transhumanism and talks of transhumanism and pictures made by transhumanists, almost all of the results are still recognizably human-like. You very rarely see these transhumanists sort of embrace a form that's totally unrecognizable as a human. I mean, even in your own picture that I'm using as the basis of the video from your article, there's a human hand and a robot hand, but the robot hand is still recognizably human-like. Next paragraph. The moral philosophy of the transhumanist movement is broadly utilitarian. One cannot judge the morality of a particular act in isolation. Its goodness depends on whether it contributes to the global pleasure of a future humanity and ultimately post-humanity. I don't see how these are contradictive, and I find that a lot of people in the whole transhumanist mindset understand that a lot of actions do have to be uh, judged on an individual basis because it's very difficult to make a very sweeping this is right, this is wrong for every single possible situation statement. But if you judge each action individually, you can still judge whether or not it contributes to the global pleasure of future humanity and ultimately post-humanity, as you put it. Next paragraph. David Pierce has developed an influential version of the transhumanist utilitarianism in the book, The Hedonistic Imperative. For Mr. Pierce, the greatest ethical task of humanity is to eliminate all suffering in the world. Just as medical science has eliminated physical suffering through anesthetics, we should now use technology to conquer all psychic suffering. Mr. Pierce endorses a vigorous use of genetic engineering and pharmacology to achieve this goal of an anguish-free humanity and post-humanity. He even supports the use of such technology to abolish pain in wild animals. End paragraph. Well, that's certainly a very lofty but ultimately noble goal of Mr. Pierce there. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it, though it's worth pointing out that medical science hasn't eliminated all physical suffering, and just to clarify, by psychic suffering, I think they mean like mental anguish, rather than say, supernatural ESP suffering. But ultimately, I don't see too much of an issue with that. Yes, we should be furthering using the science we're already developing to further eliminate suffering. I see no reason why we should, put a stop. Alright, we have anesthetics, we have this medicine, we're good. That's the end. We don't need to eliminate any more suffering that is a result of humanity's biological limitations. Next paragraph. Mr. Pierce's ethics represent the perfectionist side of the transhumanist project. He describes the mission to eliminate suffering as paradise engineering. That's in quotes, paradise engineering, and more quotes, the naturalization of heaven. The state of properly engineered post-humanity in the future is nothing less than paradisal. Quote, our descendants may live in a civilization of serenely motivated high achievers, animated by a garden of gradients of bliss. End quote. Now, this isn't just a transhumanist project. This is a project for any decent person in the medical industry. Like, that's a purpose of the medical industry, to eliminate the suffering that comes from issues related to medicine. And everything you described in the previous paragraph is just a extension of that. Genetic engineering and pharmacology are parts of modern medicine. So I don't know why you're attributing this to just transhumanism. I'd say it's one of the things that transhumanism and huge swaths of society can agree in. Suffering is bad, and it should be eliminated. The better the society is for people to live in, the better life is, and that's a good thing. How they go about that might lead to the differences, but this, paradise engineering and, ensuring that our descendants live in a civilization that's a lot better with a lot more pleasure than the one and bliss than the one we have now. That's more or less a mindset of any good parent, even. And it's worth pointing out that you're Christian. You believe that when you die, you will, and if you follow the right creed and the right God and do the right things, you'll go up to an absolute paradise. Not even by your own making, but this would still be supposedly a paradise with no suffering, that's eternal bliss. How exactly is that a decent thing to believe, but wanting to change the world to eliminate suffering in life, the one thing we know that we experience, is somehow such a strange and odd affair that's somehow inherently linked to transhumanism. You theists have the most perfectionist side of any project, believing in a perfect bliss and a perfect God that oversees that perfect bliss. Transhumanists at least understand that the world isn't perfect, but we can make it perfect. I want to know, well, you'll probably never even watch this, but if you do, I want to know what exactly is wrong with the prospect of trying our best to make life as perfect as we can through advances in technology. Why was that such a, a strange and noticeable thing to add in an article overall criticizing transhumanism? Final paragraph. Is it a strange... Wait. It is a strange utopia. Our current opioid epidemic is a cautionary tale against the dream of sedated humanity. We are still reeling from the totalitarian dream where millions perished in the name of radiant future that required some lethal cutting of ethical concerns in the meantime. The enthusiastic transhumanist revival of eugenics is a cause for alarm. Is there any place for people with disabilities in this utopia? Why would we want to abolish aging and dying, essential constitutions of the human drama, the foundation of our art and literature? Can there be love and creativity without anguish? Who will flourish and who will be eliminated in the construction of the post-human? Does nature itself have no intrinsic worth? Finally, isn't the transhumanist dream of liberating humanity from its biological and psychic creaturehood simply a high-tech surrender to an ancient temptation, ye shall be as gods? Who's afraid of transhumanism? I am. We all should be. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's just start from the top and work our way down. It is true that we are facing a very severe opioid epidemic. And the reason for that is because people keep getting prescribed opioids for things they might not need. There's prescribed these very addictive opioids with no real regulation or oversight, and a lot of people don't have access to alternatives to opioids that actually work and might give them that relief that the more strong and addictive opioids that should be used for more last resorts would. For example, in states with legal recreational or medical marijuana, the level of opioid abuse goes down. That's because they can find relief for their pain in something else. But not to make any grand assertions about this person's politics, but I wonder if, given that fact, would he then go on to advocate or support the idea of much looser laws and the elimination of a ban against marijuana, since it is a possible solution or assistance to the opioid epidemic. There's also a lot of politics involved where the current Republican administration just doesn't give a shit about this issue. If nothing else, it helps them. I don't really see this as an issue for transhumanism, since the goal is to improve upon technology and medical technology at that. So the development of medicines that don't have the negative qualities of opioids but still can provide the same relief would be one of its goals. We are still reeling from the totalitarian dream where millions perished in the name of radiant future that required some lethal cutting of ethical concerns. You've stated previously that one of the big ideas in transhumanism is if it's overall good for humanity's future. And a lot of transhumanists would say that doing away with ethical concerns and any sort in the name of blind progress isn't going to be good. And a lot of them will probably point to things like the children of the thalidomide, where being too quick to adopt a new medicine without any actual testing has led to more suffering in the world than there would have otherwise been. But the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century that espoused this notion didn't have the same sort of transhumanist mindset. They already had an ideal for humanity that was found within humanity itself. But I suppose that's a bit beside the point. Continuing on, the enthusiastic transhumanism of revival of eugenics is a cause for alarm. I ask you to ask any transhumanist who advocates for eugenics to explain what their thoughts are on how it should be carried out. Because I can almost assure you it's not going to be rounding up a bunch of people of a certain ethnicity, shipping them off to concentration camps, and turning on the gas chambers. Eugenics is the approval of humanity based on strictly DNA means. For most of human history, this meant just limiting who can breed and what babies live. It's an idea that has existed as far back as the ancient Spartans, who would examine newborn babies for any defects or signs of weaknesses, and if they did show those, they'd leave them out on the side of the road to die. But I can almost assure you now that if you ask any transhumanists about this whole, modern, or I should say beyond modern day eugenics, it would be like genetic engineering of embryos where a child is born with or has Down syndrome and that's edited out of their DNA, or sickle cell anemia, or have the genes associated with Alzheimer's later in life, that sort of thing. In which case there'd be no need for regulating breeding or killing off people of various whatever. Is there any place for people with disabilities in this utopia? No. The entire idea is to fix the issues that crop up as a result of biological limitations. If you're bound to a wheelchair, you get new legs. If you have mental retardation, there might be some future technology that can augment your brain to the point where you are able to think and act on a level of a regular human being or better. If you have a failing heart, you'd get a new heart. If you have diabetes, you'd get a better pancreas. No, there's no room for people with disabilities, and that's a good thing. Especially when you consider the fact that the goals of transhumanism are to use technology and not totalitarianism to solve the issue of the fact that some people, by virtue of accidents in life, or just a bad draw, a bad play on the genetic lottery, or just various other things, do not have the same capabilities as a regular, healthy human being. Why would we want to abolish aging and dying, which are essential to human drama and huge parts of art and literature? Because aging and dying leads to suffering. We view those things positively, and we don't even really do that because that's the only thing we have. That's the only option. We can grow old and die, or we can be young and die. But there's no be young for multitudes of years beyond what's natural for humanity and just not die. In such an event, art and literature will change to accommodate this new state. There'd be new stories about the person who decides to undergo the no aging procedure and lives past all these people who didn't undergo that procedure, and what effects it might have on him or those people. There'd be art made to celebrate the resistance or elimination of death. I don't see why we need to celebrate bad things just because they've been big parts of, or keep bad things because they've been big parts of human history and have been used so much in art and literature. War has been a huge part of the human drama, and it is a cornerstone of our art and literature. But that doesn't mean that the drive to end war is a bad thing. To the contrary, it's quite good, because it leads to a copious amount of human suffering. Can there be love and creativity without anguish? I don't know. Can there be love and creativity in heaven? You tell me. You tell me if in your idea of this realm you go to when you die, that has no suffering or anguish and is perpetual bliss with Jesus Christ, if there can be love and creativity, then you tell me and I'll give you the same answer, but say we can make that here, in this world. We can make that, and love and creativity would still be available. Who will flourish and who will be eliminated in this construction of post-human? That actually is a major issue in transhumanism. There's no delusion, or shouldn't be, that people much more wealthy now, if these technologies emerge within our lifetime, would have immediate access to them, and the rest would have to catch up. And that is a problem, and I'll be willing to leave it at that, because I think it might be better for a separate video. But I will give you that point, that it is indeed an issue. I think it's more of an issue of society in relation to transhumanism, but it still involves transhumanism too heavily to just dump on society, like the opioid epidemic. And isn't it just a high-tech version of surrender to a temptation of ye shall be gods? Well, as someone who's more in favor of Prometheus and Jesus Christ, I have no problem with humanity's aspiring to godhood. We are a species that understands the universe far better than anything else alive that we know of. And while we do not know for certain that there are gods, we do know for certain there is humanity. I see no reason why we shouldn't have this power, or these abilities of the gods, just like we sort of do have now. We can traverse the world faster than any natural human being thanks to technology. We have access to more information than any natural human possibly could thanks to technology. We can withstand injuries and sicknesses that a natural person would succumb to, and even prevent them thanks to technology. and we can control the elements in ways that no natural human being could, thanks to technology. We've already sort of climbed up to that pedestal of godhood. We now wield lightning better than Thor or Zeus. Now you, as a Christian, might see this as a bad thing, but that's based on a strictly theological matter, not a transhumanist one. If I would give you any advice, I'd say try to find some theist transhumanists. If you can stand the difference in denomination, there's the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and that might be a better question for them than the average reader like me, who might be an atheist and not even see an issue with this. So who's afraid of transhumanism? I'm not. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think everyone should be. But to cower away in fear of this, especially when the things listed are trying to eliminate suffering from the world, is ludicrous in my opinion. We'd be better off moving forward in this direction with our eyes open than our eyes closed. So that's my response to this article. I mean, all things considered, it wasn't an awful article. There's some really crap rejections or anti-transhumanist articles and videos out there, especially from a religious point of view. Like on YouTube, you have all these nutty channels like the Satanic New World Order Transhumanist Agenda Revealed by some channel called Jesus Christ Demon Hunter, and the description is just a bunch of conspiratorial ramblings and Bible verses. This is, more or less an actual criticism of transhumanism, of what transhumanism actually is, but I think he got a lot wrong in it. So I'll link the article in the description and you can read it for yourself, and you can decide if you agree with it or if you disagree with it or if you think my assessment was fair or not. But I think that concludes this video. Thank you for watching. I hope I gave you something to think about or otherwise entertained you. Take care.